Good evening and welcome to the Gender Speaker live show. It's Sunday evening and time for my LGBTQ history show. So, LGBTQ history, and tonight we're going to be talking about gay liberation. And I'm following on a little bit from last week. I was talking last week about Magnus Hirschfeld in Germany, who had really started the gay rights campaign, battling against paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code. All of that, of course, came to an end with the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And I think there's just to follow on from that, the last thing I talked about last week was the problem that around 50,000 gay men and trans women, because they would have been considered in the same group, were arrested by the Nazis. It's difficult to know how many, but estimates suggest about 15,000 went into concentration camps, mostly into a particular camp where they were used for medical experimentation. But one of the things that's not talked about is that when the liberation came, once the Allies had actually defeated the Nazis were pushed back, the British and Americans had released the prisoners from the camps, mostly obviously the Jewish survivors. But unfortunately, they didn't release the gay prisoners. Various different groups of people within the German camps had been given band. Yellow was the Jewish one. Pink, the pink triangle was the symbol for the gay prisoners. And they were re-imprisoned because by being gay, having been arrested for gay, they were still in breach of sexual offences acts in Britain and in America. And so they refused to release them. And we saw also, of course, the appalling treatment of Alan Turing, the man who single-handedly probably helped to win the Second World War for the Allies, and yet because he was gay, was afterwards humiliated, bullied, and eventually took his own life. So the prisoners in Germany from these camps went on to, in some cases, it seems about another 20 years of persecution in prisons for being gay. And so I want to look a little bit about what happened after the war to start to change things. One of the things I have noticed, I often say, changing laws is relatively easy. Actually, not easy. It's quite difficult, but it's relatively easy when compared to changing attitudes. Because one of the reasons why it took so long to change the law in this country is because the attitude of anti-LGBT had been built up and embedded in society, and it's still there today, despite now 60, 70 years of changes in the law and changes in attitudes at a political level. We still have huge problems in this country. In some countries it's still illegal. In some countries, it's still a death penalty. Who can imagine that? And as you know now, that's our fault. We started it in 1533 with the Buggery Act. So, 1957, things started to change. John Wolfenden had been asked by the then Conservative government to put together a committee to study and look at this. Now, to be honest, a lot of the reason why the Conservatives were backing often through private members' bills, but were backing changes in the sexuality laws to make homosexuality legal, is because it was a primary source of blackmail, and therefore it was a real threat to national security. If a MP was gay, and a lot are, but if they were gay and it's illegal, and somebody found out, because they'd gone to a gay club, which is what would often happen, they could then be blackmailed and pressure put on them. And of course, if the Russians, and we're in the midst of the Cold War in 1957, If the Russians found out that a high-ranking British civil servant or British politician was having a relationship that might be a gay relationship, that gave them huge leverage to start getting, classified secrets, getting them to do things for them. So there was a lot of pressure to try and get rid of this law because it was really, really affecting the national security. Unfortunately, the Conservative government just backed down. A private member's bill was put forward. It failed. And then the Conservative government lost. And we had our first Labour government when Harold Wilson came to power in 1967, 10 years later. And one of the first things the Labour government did was to pass the Sex Offences Act, which partially decriminalised homosexuality. Now, I'm saying partially decriminalised it because everybody thinks, oh, that's it, homosexuality was made legal. It was, but with a proviso. It was legal only for adults. And back then, that was 21. I remember that because in 1967, I was 17 years old. And I was waiting for, I was going to be able to vote. In 1971, I would be 21 and I'd be able to vote. I had to get to 21 to be able to do anything. It wasn't 18 then, it had to be 21. So homosexuality was only legal for adult males. So that's the first thing. You couldn't do anything if you were under 21. So no sex if you were under 21. And the other thing was it had to be in private. Now, nobody defined what private meant. But when some of these cases went to court, the courts decided that private meant nobody else in the building. Now, this created a huge problem because a lot of gay men were married. Just as a lot of trans women got married. Because if you were trans, if you were gay, and you were at risk of being publicly humiliated in the press, at risk of being arrested and sent to prison, then it made sense to hide the fact that you were gay. So a lot of gay men got married because that was a cover for their relationship. Trans women got married because that was a cover. Nobody would have thought that they were trans if they were in a heterosexual relationship, in a heterosexual marriage. And so this happened an awful lot. But of course, what that meant was that there would be quiet relationships. And where do you go for a quiet relationship with somebody? Well, you book yourself into a hotel, book a room and pop into the room. And here's where the problem came. Hotels would watch, and if they saw two men going, booking into a room and checking into a room, they give it half an hour, phone the police would prompt round, burst into the bedroom, catch them in bed together. And because they were not the only people in the building, they were in the privacy of their own room, but that was sufficient for them to be arrested. There were more arrests for homosexuality after 1967 than were taking place before, because all of a sudden there was a way to be able to catch people who thought they were safe. So in Britain, at least we were moving forward. In America, things were much, much more difficult. And part of the problem in America was that, and is that, homosexuality, transgenderism is covered by state law, not by federal law. Now, the Supreme Court can make decisions on things, and in 2003, a decision was made in the Supreme Court, which essentially meant that to criminalize someone for a same-sex act was a breach of the American Constitution. That, therefore, meant that from 2003 onwards, pretty much every state had to accept that homosexuality was now legal. There are still attempts to try and bend around it. The group, of course, at the moment who are not protected by those federal laws are trans people, which is why they're the target of so much hate, so much pressure, because it's a way to be able to get at the LGBT community. So let's just have a look at what was happening in America for a minute, because things were slightly different. Get rid of that partial. Now, let's just get my slide moving. There we go. So, Sex Offences Act 1967 partially decriminalized things here in America. not quite the same. What's happening in America, it was illegal, for example, in New York, to cross-dress. So anybody caught wearing more than 3 items, you had to be wearing at least 3 items of clothing that were appropriate to your physical sex. So if you were born with a male body, you had to have at least 3 items of male clothing on. Otherwise, you could be arrested. Same for women. If you were not wearing at least 3 items of female clothing, you could be arrested for cross-dressing. It was only a local law, but it was a way in which the police could continually harass the LGBT community. They could harass lesbian and gay because, all the drag queens were wearing female clothing. So it meant that drag queens had to make sure they were wearing boxer shorts or something underneath the clothing, which made it clear that they were male. The trans women and some of the trans prostitutes didn't bother. So that was part of the problem that was going on. So let's try and take us. Here we are in 1969. I was 19 years old at that particular time. Not really aware of all this. I was a redcoat at Butlins on June the 27th, 1969. But in New York, in Greenwich Village, it was the hippie era. Okay, this was a time of free love. It's a time when people, men and women were wearing pretty much the same sorts of clothes anyway. We were all wearing, it was flowers in your hair, it was kaftans and tie-dyed T-shirts and loon pants. And it was a good time. For me, it was great. I didn't have to cross-dress. I could wear clothes that were very feminine, and actually it was all taking okay. Now, the problem is if you were in a community that's really not being treated very well, if it's being constantly harassed by the police, that's a ripe opportunity. If it's illegal to be gay, well, that made an opportunity for the mafia. So what they did was to open up some bars or take over bars and make it available so that gay people could come in, and you could go in and you could dance with each other in their bars. You could buy their watered down drinks. And they would largely protect the community because they could make money by offering a service that nobody else could offer. And they could also do deals with the police. And the deals were very simple. The police would let them know when they were going to raid. They would raid them every so often, arrest a couple of people. It was a constant process of harassment, and the mafia paid the police off, and the police did it. So there we go. That's what's happening. So everything in Greenwich Village, in terms of the gay community, tended to focus around one small inn called the Stonewall Inn, a late-night bar. It sold drinks. There was no running water, so they just had a couple of buckets of water to rinse out the glasses in. So as the night go on, it was a good idea to hang on to your glass if you could, because God knows what that would have been like. But you could dance with a same-sex partner and nobody's going to argue. You could meet up with people who were looking for a trans woman because they wanted to have a relationship with a trans woman. It was that kind of bar, perhaps a little seedy. There are some in London like this even now. But that's the world that we live in. And there are a lot of trans women, a lot of gay men, young gay boys who are there trading their services. Everything. Prostitution isn't just about women. Prostitution's also, there are lots of people looking for sex and different kinds of variations on it. And that was what was happening here. But the police basically would come down and bust them once a month. So they busted them on the Tuesday. This was the Friday night, 27th, going on to the 28th. They'd been busted on the Tuesday, so nobody thought they were going to get busted. And this was a particularly difficult night because Judy Garland had died, and it was her memorial. And she'd been a great icon of the gay community. So a disproportionate number of the gay community had come into Greenwich Village for the night. And it wasn't so much that they were it wasn't like a wake for Judy Garland, but there was a sense of sadness that she had gone. And so people were around. There was constant harassment going on. And this is the thing about Stonewall. There are lots of different stories about what happened at the Stonewall Inn on this particular night. I've read lots of them, and this is what I've taken from it. Looks to be close to what actually happened. There was tension that night going on. Everybody was in the Stonewall Inn. We don't know exactly who was in there, but there's a fair idea. Lots of people claim they were. Lots of people say no, they weren't. But but who can tell? But the problem was that the police had decided that night they were going to close it down for good. And that's really important because this was an unexpected raid. The mafia hadn't been warned. The police, and I've forgotten the name of the guy now, but the police who were constantly harassing the gay community decided that's it. This place was going to be shut down, and that was the end of it. So they turned up, and everybody's in the Stonewall Inn. The police arrive for their unexpected raid on the club. In the club that night, Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, we're not sure if she was there. These are two very well-known trans women within the LGBT community. Sylvia Rivera ran an organization called STAR, which helped basically young trans kids on the street, often sex workers. Sylvia Rivera was a sex worker, also a drag queen, did drag performances. Sylvia died of cancer in the 2000s, about 10, 15 years ago. Marsha sadly found floating in the Hudson River only a few years after all these events. So everybody's in the Stonewall Inn. In come the police, and this is the thing that they do. Anybody who is dressed in clothes that look as if they're not the right clothes for their gender has to go into the back room where a policewoman will come in and check their bodies to see if they've got the appropriate number of items of clothing that they're wearing for the body that they've got. So they're going to have a look, check what genitals they've got, see what clothes they've got. If they're basically cross-dressed, they're going to be arrested and taken down in the Black Maria. If they're not, they can be chucked out. So everybody else is chucked out in the street, and normally they would just dissipate. This night, didn't happen. Everybody hung around, and people started to gather. What the hell's going on? What's happening? Some of the mafia organizers, the employees were arrested and taken out first of all. They were a bit annoyed because they hadn't been warned about all this. Some of the trans women were taken down, refused to be identified, refused to go into the back room. This is, again, something that had not normally happened. Everybody it was just a bit of tension in the air. And they said, no, you're not going to check tonight. You're not going to check me. So they sent them down and put them in the Black Maria. So they're sitting in the Black Maria, and somebody starts to rock the Black Maria. And then the police are getting really a bit panicky about this and run back into the Stonewall Inn. And everything's getting a little bit out of control. People are gathering around, and instead of dispersing, suddenly a crowd of about 120 people, 200 people outside, suddenly is a crowd of 500 people, and people are coming from all directions. What's going on? What's going on? And somebody starts to throw coins at the Stonewall Inn. All of these in allusion to the paybacks to the police from the mafia. Now, the big argument is who threw the first brick. We don't know. I've read all sorts of different stories. And does it really matter? Yeah, somebody threw a brick. Someone was going to throw a brick. It had to happen. Somebody threw a brick and crashed. That started it. All of a sudden, they're starting to throw bricks, masonry. They're tearing up anything it can throw. The police back into the Stonewall Inn. Now this is getting well out of control. They don't know what they're doing. A window gets smashed. Somebody pours lighter fluid, a lighter fuel over the window and lights it. There's Molotov cocktails now starting to be thrown, and suddenly the whole thing has erupted. Inside, the police are now not knowing what to do. They're literally trapped inside the Stonewall Inn, and they hit the panic button, and in come the riot police. 3 days of rioting ripped apart Greenwich Village. It wasn't actually 3 consecutive days. It was actually 3 days over a period, but it had changed everything. The whole Black Panther movement that had been going on beforehand was probably partly to do with this, because the gay community had seen the black community saying, no, enough. And we've seen how that pans out in Black Lives Matter. But this was it. The gay community said, no, the fairies are fighting back. That was one of the headlines. That was it. The end of oppression. No more being pushed around, no more being denied who you are, because the next step was to come out. And a year later on, where are we? Here we go. On Christopher Street, which is the street where this happened, the first gay pride march was 1970. So the reason I'm talking about this is a sad year, isn't it? Because of COVID, all of the gay prides have stopped. We didn't get a chance to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first march on Christopher Street because all of us have been shut down and locked in, which is why we're getting some reactions, I think, back from people saying, hey, is this just a way of governments being able to control people? The first London march was in 1972, so hopefully in 2022 we'll be able to do the 50th anniversary of that. But all across the world in 1970, 71, 72, marches were beginning to be had in memory of what happened at Stonewall and the Christopher Street riots. It was called the Gay Liberation Movement and Gay Liberation Front, the GLF. And everything started to change and transform. And that was where we were with the whole shift into the gay liberation movement that literally went across the world, because very quickly gay pride, they weren't actually gay pride marches. These were actually protest marches. We were still fighting for rights, fighting to get rid of the homosexuality being illegal, fighting for the right to be ourselves, to get out there and just do our thing. Now, in Britain, things moved on and steadily things were getting better until all of a sudden in 1988, a conservative lord doing a visit to a school discovered that there was this book now being produced for schools showing a child with gay parents. And she was absolutely horrified that children were being indoctrinated into homosexuality. And she campaigned like mad and got a section put into the Local Government Act which said that it was illegal for local authorities and therefore schools to promote homosexuality as a normal family arrangement. So we suddenly went backwards. From having got to the point where we were beginning to open things up and actually get people to positively accept that homosexuality is just a part of life, that transgenderism was just a part of life, suddenly we can't talk about it. We're not allowed to talk about it in schools. We're not allowed to publish documents. You can't fund and support charities for LGBT aims. And of course, that was therefore the Stonewall charity in the UK was set up to fight Section 28. When I first came to Hull, and I came out in 2001, 2002, and I arrived in Hull just as the first Pride was being put together. And it was called Pride then, but it was still very much a protest. So we were going to march through the streets, and we did, with placards all about opposed to Section 28. It took until 2003 for that to finally be changed. And a whole lot of law changed. And I'm going to tackle all that in another event looking at this. So that's just a little bit of the roots of what happened for the campaign for rights. Interestingly, when you look at it now, prides are not about fighting for changes in law. We've pretty much done all the changes in law. Gay people are now able to be themselves. We've still got to deal with covering. We've still got to deal with the fact that people are frightened to come out in the workplace. We've still a whole stack of things that have got to be tackled and dealt with. And I'm going to be addressing some of those over the weeks in these shows. But I will be carrying on with randomly picking various different items from LGBT history as we go along. I'll pick up, if I see things in the news that look good, I'll pick them up. So don't forget, I've got a trans and non-binary inclusion workshop that I'm running. This is just an introductory workshop about transgender, non-binary, and what all that means. The first one is on the sorry, didn't mean that. Yeah, that's taking place 20th of October. You'll find the details in the blurb down below. I'm also putting all these onto a YouTube channel and also on a podcast, and you can find links to that as well. If you just go to your normal podcast app, just look for Gender Speaker Live, you'll get the show, or pop to genderspeaker.com and you'll find links there. Incidentally, the transgender non-binary workshop, it's a donation basis. Pay what you can afford. I've got to try and get some money to run all these things and to keep the hardware and software together. But I want more than anything else. I'm just trying to help people to understand what LGBTQ is all about and how we can change it. I'll be back again on Wednesday with another show about gender issues and some chat about gender issues. Not sure what I'm tackling there. It's been a really, really busy week with the PSA convention all week, and that really has been an amazing event. Going to be writing and talking about that shortly. So join me 4 p.m. next Wednesday. Hopefully it'll be 4 p.m. I'm aiming for that. Might be a little bit later. Hope you enjoyed this show. Just a little bit of background into the whole transformation of what Stonewall's all about and how it's led to all the transformative changes that are still taking place across the world. Look forward to seeing you Wednesday. Take care.